The Roaring Twenties were a time of abundance. Jobs were plentiful, people were far more social than in previous decades due to the invention of silent movies and cartoons, as well as the popularity of dancing. The average family had access to at least one vehicle, and labor-saving inventions were very popular. American spending was higher than it had ever been. It was such a time of huge success and consumerism for the United States in the wake of World War I that nobody was prepared for what the next decade would bring. In this next unit, we will be learning about one of America's darkest periods, the Great Depression. To understand what this was, we have to understand the factors that caused the Great Depression. In this lesson, I will be going over 7 major causes. At the end, you should be able to describe them and how they contributed to the onset of the Great Depression. So what does depression mean in this context? An economic depression is a period of long-term economic downturn that is the result of lowered economic activity in one or more major national economies. Over the course of this lesson, we will look at 7 major causes as follows: buying on credit in the 20s, the stock market crash, bank failures, the gap between the rich and the poor, a reduction in purchasing, the Hawley-Smoot tariff, and lastly, the Dust Bowl. First, let's talk about buying on credit. This was a huge problem, which we already know got its start in the 20s. Under this system, consumers could make installment payments, weekly, monthly, or annually. These types of purchases were generally reserved for big-ticket items which a family may not have the budget for. But as long as they had a steady job, they could afford to make a series of smaller payments. Many families purchased more than a couple big items using these installment plans. What they were not prepared for was for the stock market to crash as a result. You see, it wasn't only the everyday citizen who was buying on credit. Banks and even governments were also participating, and we reached a point when no one was using real money, and no one had the money to pay back when their loans were called in. So stock prices, which are a good indicator of how our economy is doing, took a plunge. As a result, people lost their jobs and couldn't pay back their debts. This stock market crash is known as Black Tuesday and occurred on October 29, 1929. Over the coming days, stockholders lost more than $40 billion, and while the market was able to regain some of its losses within a year, it wasn't enough to prevent what was worse to come. As you can see, stock prices rose exponentially between 1927 and 1929 before dropping off a cliff. By 1930, the market regains about half of what it had lost, but then experiences a series of steep declines until 1932. Once the market crashed, banks quickly followed. Today, our bank deposits are insured up to a certain amount, but this wasn't the case back then. When the banks didn't have the money to pay their debts, the money they had went towards as much of it as possible. However, this meant they did not have the money to give people who were trying to withdraw from their accounts, and their savings were simply gone. Banks also could not risk giving new loans to people to help them pay off debt. The bank's demise quickly led to less and less consumer spending until it was nearly non-existent. During this time, the gap between the rich and the poor widened tremendously. The rich were largely unaffected, although most made fewer profits during this time, but the middle class ceased to exist. More than 70% of American families earned less than $2,500 per year. Most families relied on soup kitchens and church donations to survive, and many became homeless. So like I said before, it's no surprise that people stopped spending money, and this continued to negatively impact the economy. When consumers stop buying, businesses have to decrease their workforce, so people lost their jobs and could not repay items bought on credit, which led to those items being repossessed. And the vicious cycle would continue. Unemployment rose to a whopping 25% during the Great Depression. For perspective, a healthy economy has anywhere between 3 to 5% unemployment. Our government wasn't just standing by watching this happen, though. In order to try and help American companies, President Hoover and Congress created the Hawley-Smoot Tariff in 1930. It charged a high tax on imports, which was designed to encourage partnerships with American companies and keep Americans at work. But it backfired and created trade wars between the United States and foreign countries. Ultimately, this led to greater economic downturn. Lastly, the Dust Bowl was a major contributing factor for the effect it had on jobs in the farming industry. The Dust Bowl made the Great Depression worse by wrecking Midwestern farms in the 1930s. The dry weather, high winds, and bad farming hurt crops and soil, making lots of farmers poor and forcing them to move. This ruined the economy because there were fewer crops, less money, and more people moving to cities. It made things more difficult for everyone, both in the countryside and in the cities. Take a moment to review this map. It gives us an illustration of where the Dust Bowl did the most damage, in addition to where farmers leaving the Midwest moved to. So, what were the 7 causes of the Great Depression, and how are they connected to each other?